What kind of economic punishment will Putin get from North Korea? How does China abandon Russia by rail, and why is a strong ruble bad? Or maybe I'm wrong, of course. We will figure out all this and more right now. Ірина Узлова is my name, and with me is Maxim Blант, Economist Maxim. Hello, we are glad to welcome you to our broadcast.
Good afternoon.
Putin's Kim Jong-un pact. The second part, of course, sounds somehow humiliating for the Russian Federation, but these are the friends and partners Putin has now, who unleashes wars against peaceful states. The DPRK is also not much different. It wants to, but so far it either cannot or is waiting. They signed a document on comprehensive cooperation. There are public details. It is clear that there are no more public ones, but they have been officially fixed. Through this document of the Russian Federation, the DPRK will seek to increase the volume of bilateral trade and create favorable conditions for economic cooperation, as it was written in the best days of the Soviet Union. Of course, I understand that Russia will probably give. Well, Kim Jong-un, judging by the video, is not starving, but his people, of course, unlike him, have a different opinion and living conditions. Russia will give food, possibly in exchange for weapons. And what can the DPRK increase in the volume of bilateral trade? What to offer? Flatbreads made of greens? Or, in fact, is there something to exchange in this aspect as well, in addition to weapons?
Well, first of all, this is really a weapon, of course, and Russia will provide not only food, but, apparently, some missile technology. Because Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung did not manage to build normal missiles for a very long time. For some reason, they constantly walked towards the Sea of Japan. But somehow everything fell down for them. Therefore, apparently, Russia will also transfer some missile technology to North Korea. And China is very dissatisfied with this. In return, yes, they will receive Soviet-style weapons, shells above all. In addition, Russia has an acute shortage of labor. Therefore, apparently, some workers will go towards Russia, and they have been used since the very beginning of the war. It was about using Koreans for restoration and construction work in the first territories. Perhaps they will be in demand in Russian agriculture and so on. That is, labor is what Russia is sorely lacking now. And it is also necessary from North Korea. Apparently, some Chinese goods will go through North Korea, which are subject to sanctions, respectively, since China has never terminated relations with North Korea. And for China, North Korea is about the same as Belarus is for Russia. Well, now Russia is in approximately the same status. The most sensitive, let's say, goods and components in order to produce Russian weapons, apparently, will go through Korea.
Putin stressed that the improvement of such relations at various levels between Russia and the DPRK will be useful for China as a joint partner of the DPRK in the Russian Federation. But you say, Maxim, and our experts that China, looking at all this and the signed document, is not very flattered and rejoices. And why?
Well, first of all, because China is not very happy, because after all, North Korea is his. This is his.
Everything is mine.
And therefore, when Russia tries to somehow establish relations with his vassal, this does not make him very happy. Prior to that, Korea was absolutely completely dependent on China. If there is now someone else who can offer what the Chinese are proposing, then Kim Jong-un may not be such a good partner for China. This is the first thing. Secondly, Kim's inadequacy is more or less obvious to everyone. And let me remind you that Putin was going to fly directly from China to North Korea, and the Chinese comrades advised against it. They said, no, 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 let's go back, fly separately, cutlets separately, you will fly to Korea on your own from your Russia, that's somehow regardless of our visit. This is the first thing. And secondly, China has begun consultations with South Korea, against the backdrop of this visit, about security guarantees and the like. Therefore, they make it clear to the Koreans that they do not behave very well. They need to rethink their policy, including in relation to Russia.
When dual-use goods or sanctioned goods go intensively through the territory of Korea from China, then it will be pointless to impose sanctions against Korea. And in general, how will this be proved, and what can be the counteraction mechanism here? Maybe, perhaps, the same sanctions, but more directly to China, or it will not be possible to reduce it in any way?
I think it will be possible to reduce it, but for this it will be necessary to prove in some way that Chinese goods enter Russia, or goods enter Russia through Chinese firms. It will be more difficult to do, but, nevertheless, nothing is impossible. And, in fact, there is the same sanctions regime. If they catch Chinese firms supplying some goods to Korea, then this will also be, apparently, a reason for the introduction of secondary sanctions. Therefore, not everything is so clear here. Just today, it was reported that a major manufacturer of Chinese electric cars has banned the supply of its goods to Russia from June 30th. They are still supplied to Russia, but they are imported by private individuals. That is, Chinese companies, not all of them, with their pants up, are running to trade with Russia, and American sanctions are secondary, no matter what the Chinese leadership says, a serious risk for them, if we are talking, first of all, of course, about serious large firms that operate in the European market or in the American market. They are still looking to comply with international sanctions.
And what will this ban on the supply of electric cars from the companies that announced this be fraught with for Russia?
They are not fraught with anything, they are already supplied semi-officially. This is not smuggling. Of course, they are transported exclusively by individuals. And what is this fraught with for buyers? No warranty. If the manufacturer prohibits the supply of his goods to a particular country, then it is stupid to contact him from this country and point out defects in the production of the goods. Accordingly, cars worth 5 to 6 million rubles turn into a disposable thing. You bought it, rode it, something broke, you have to throw it away. Of course, I exaggerate this, because spare parts are imported in the same way, consumables are imported in the same way. But all this is for money, again. You can, of course, fix it, but not under warranty.
When we talk about evidence, they seem to be talking about it from the United States of America. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, speaking the other day at a joint press conference with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, said that according to the United States, 70% of workbenches and 90% of microelectronics just come to the Russian Federation from China. How impressive are these numbers? And this is already proof. Is it possible to somehow operate with them and act further?
Yes, but they cannot completely impose sanctions against the whole of China, because the entire Chinese economy, first of all, is still for a moment the first, or even the second, as they believe, the economy of the world. If we take the production of goods and distract ourselves from all financial services, then it is certainly the first. This is the main factory in the world. And no economy can be left without this factory. China is very much integrated into all markets, despite the trade wars that have been going on since the time of Donald Trump. The Chinese economy is still a significant part of the world economy. Accordingly, if we talk about sanctions, then only against some specific Chinese companies that supply these products to Russia. So, in fact, now the American authorities are doing this. And the events in the Russian foreign exchange market are largely due to the fact that in addition to the Moscow exchange, the latest sanctions package included companies from China and Hong Kong. This is exactly what is being said. The Americans found specific companies that supplied microelectronics, chips, and semiconductors in Russia. On the basis of the fact that they were able to prove that these companies specifically supplied these goods, they imposed sanctions and included them in the sanctions list. Accordingly, other companies, Chinese, have already begun to approach deliveries to Russia more cautiously. And this whole story, starting from the end of last year, has a strong impact on China's exports to Russia. And not only some components, but everything in general. Therefore, the ruble is strengthening, because exports are falling. A new round of sanctions has led to the fact that fears that Chinese goods will go to Russia. This is now the main supplier of everything to Russia, not only components for the production of weapons, but also all electronics, household appliances, cars, everything that is sold imported in Russia.
Бытовой техники, автомобилей, вот все, что продается импортно в России.
Half of this comes from China, even more than half, because other channels of supply to Russia, both Chinese production of goods and any European or American parallel imports, they are also slowly curtailing their activities. Previously, there was Turkey, the United Arab Emirates. European companies often supplied their products, but as the flywheel of secondary sanctions unwinds, it becomes more and more dangerous, less and less profitable.
Got it. Thank you very much. In general, such targeted sanctions, and so that others are discouraged, and these others, who are not discouraged, are becoming more and more careful, and this affects the number of exports. How much will this pact with Pyongyang affect the degradation of Moscow's relations with Seoul and Tokyo? Because, as I understand it, it was not only this last argument that was a deterrent to cooperation, the fear of pushing Moscow to strengthen ties with Pyongyang. Now this fear is gone, because ties have already strengthened and have been confirmed by an official piece of paper. And how important were economic relations with Seoul and Tokyo for the modernization and existence of the Russian economy?
Well, of course, both South Korea and Japan. The Japanese, they were a little late for the Russian market, just like when they decided that they would invest in joint projects now. That's when everything happened, and international sanctions began, so many Japanese companies did not have time. Those who succeeded, in particular, in gas projects, in some oil projects, they bitterly regretted it, although, in general, they are not in a hurry to curtail their projects here. Nevertheless, Japan, as part of the G7, takes part in almost all the sanctions and participates in the discussion of all the measures that are directed against Russia and the Russian economy. As for South Korea, they also adhere to the sanctions regime from the very beginning. Let me remind you that Samsung, which was one of the main brands in Russia, not only in the production and sale of phones, but also in the sale of any gadgets, laptops, tablets and so on, it officially stopped deliveries to Russia, and South Korean cars also stopped being supplied.
Он прекратил поставки в Россию официально. Южнокорейские автомобили тоже прекратили поставляться.
Therefore, in principle, Putin has practically nothing to lose either from Japan or from South Korea.
Терять ни со стороны Японии, ни со стороны Южной Кореи, практически нечего.
They have already ended their relationship.
Прекратили отношения.
The question is that after the withdrawal, this die-march with Kim Jong-un, the resumption of these relations, even after Putin, will be a problematic enough story.
It is very interesting. Will they not want to get involved, given such risks and understanding that any subsequent head in Russia can take such steps without tarnishing themselves? What will be the main ones here?
Well, at least until this agreement signed by Putin is officially terminated.
Maxim, today we talk with the advisor to the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, with Mikhailo Podolyak. I had an interview. Discussing in particular the amount of microelectronics from China, we noticed again and repeated to ourselves that, unfortunately, in the missiles that fly at our heads, there are components from the United States of America. Of course, also private companies that allow themselves this, but many of them have not left the Russian markets. Some of them also boast that the profit is not bad from this failure to come to them. And why does this happen? Do those companies that remain really receive such profits from the Russian Federation? Have they been paid more? And here is only the economic benefit or perhaps something else?
You know, I think that money is definitely the main goal for many businessmen. It has always been like this. There are companies that use child labor. There are companies that conduct business in a very unethical way, pollute others. There are companies that profit from the war. In any war, starting from the First World War, there have always been people who are ready for any dirty tricks for the sake of money. Well, actually, there is nothing to be surprised about. And many are proud that they make money on it. For those companies that make a profit no matter what, it is obviously more important for them to give their shareholders an extra 3 cents as dividends than to adhere to any ethical standards. Another thing is that, again, I say that this is a risk, and the risk of falling under some kind of sanctions even concerns American companies.
Think so, but apparently, so far they think that these risks are less than the profit that they have. Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, right?
Well, that's always the case, yes. The higher the risks, the more profit they demand. That is, the more expensive those components are for the Russian military-industrial complex. So you always have to pay for the risk. The risks are growing. I would like to remind you that these sanctions imposed by developed countries, including Australia and so on, were initially quantitative, that is, they increased the number of sanctions.
Packages.
And only a year and a half after the start of the war, they began to understand that quantity does not always mean quality. That no matter how many bans they impose, if these bans are leaky, and no one monitors their implementation of these prohibitions, they are of no use. Therefore, it was only in 2023 that they began to pay attention to how these sanctions are being implemented. Hence the fight against the shadow fleet, secondary sanctions against financial institutions. And immediately some results began to appear. There, Greek tankers stopped carrying Russian oil at some point, Turkish and Arab banks began to close the accounts of Russian companies, and so on. That is, now the entire sanctions story is aimed precisely at monitoring compliance with what has already been adopted. Moreover, for example, a special official has already appeared in the UK who monitors compliance with sanctions.
So, the tactic of 1,000 cuts turns into the tactics of 100 cuts, but larger, it seems to me. Slowly but surely, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and China understand the risks, apparently, because they decided after 27 years of discussions and consultations to build a railway to Europe bypassing Russia. Just like that. And in particular, Central Asia expert David Concarini says that for China, another way to the west and east is important, except for Russia, because the route through Russia is no longer safe and the road to Europe can be suddenly closed and everything is the same as before, so it is very important for China to master a new route. Very interesting. 27 years old. The die is cast. What prompted it? What could be the last such moment for making this decision? How painful or at least unpleasant is this even reputational for the Russian Federation?
Look, yes, Russia has always considered itself the main transit land route for Chinese goods, and all the talk about the southern branch of the Great Silk Road was quite painful. As for China, of course, all the inadequate talk about nuclear weapons, the conduct of some kind of exercises using nuclear weapons, especially all the nonsense that everyone will die, and we, in my opinion, will go to heaven. Well, of course, when such conversations begin, talk about the safety of this or that. Wait a second, I'm going to close the balcony now.
Yes, let's do it. Okay.
This is already stupid, so the risks are much higher than the cost that will have to be paid for a detour, for a route that bypasses Russia. Here again the same story. High risks, respectively, the money that should be spent on eliminating these risks, they are justified. This, in fact, is simple logic.
Experts note that the annual volume of cargo transportation, when this railway is built, will reach 15 million tons, and the delivery time of goods to end consumers will be reduced by 7 days. And do I understand it correctly that in the long term, and China is planning everything both diplomatically and economically in the long term, in principle, in essence and politics, this suggests that China's relations with Europe not only do not want to lose, but want to establish even more for itself.
Yes, of course, everything depends here, of course, on the desire of Europe. And I have said more than once that both the United States and Europe could persuade Xi to stop cooperation with Putin and political support, and stop all the supply of sensitive products, including components for the production of weapons, in a very simple way, not by pressure, not by threats, by imposing some kind of secondary sanctions, but simply by offering in exchange to lift the trade restrictions that have been imposed on Chinese manufacturers.
А просто предложив в обмен отменить те торговые ограничения, которые введены против китайских.
I'm talking about the trade war that Donald Trump started. And, in general, under Biden, it continued. In exchange for this, the Chinese would certainly abandon the Russian market, because, despite all the huge size of the Russian territory, Russia is slightly smaller than the Netherlands in terms of trade turnover for China.
Но по товарообороту для Китая Россия чуть меньше Голландии. Поэтому, собственно, но...
But now China reigns supreme in this small Holland of 1/6 of the Earth's size.
Маленькой Голландии размером за 1/6 часть суши.
But if he had been offered the European and American markets, of course, they would have agreed to give a damn about all this. Moreover, no one would suggest abandoning Russia. Well, for God's sake, if you want to supply your socks and bicycles, you don't mind either.
Yes, but socks and bicycles too, in principle, will soon come in handy in such a situation, apparently. And 5 times more, yes, the trade turnover between China, the United States and Europe, compared to Russia, or even these numbers are even higher?
Yes, well, listen, Russia accounts for about 3.5% of China's total foreign trade. So do the math.
Indeed, Holland. So let's write it down. Good realistic, practical comparison. Thank you. Maxim, we have already reminded that the ruble is strengthening. It has really strengthened to a maximum over the past year. The reason is the turbulence after the imposition of sanctions against the Moscow exchange on the 13th. We saw that they were nevertheless introduced on June 13th. On the plus side, the strong ruble carries a decrease in import prices. It seems to be good for the consumer. On the other hand, for budget exporters, a strong ruble is a bad signal. This is what I understand at this level. Can you please explain in depth why this is good in some moments and for whom, in fact, why it is worse than those moments in which it can play a plus?
Look, as for the fact that this is good for consumers, this is an illusion, because one of the main reasons for the strengthening of the ruble is the fear that the Chinese will stop supplying their goods.
Опасения относительно того, что китайцы прекратят поставлять свои товары.
Accordingly, there is concern on the part of importers and not only fear, because since the beginning of the year, Russian imports, including from China, have been falling, and this is due to the fact that Chinese banks have begun to make payments for both Russian imports and Russian exports very poorly.
Как за российский импорт, так и за российский экспорт.
Constant complaints that payment for goods that should be delivered to Russia takes up to 3 to 4 months. Payments are delayed, some are blocked, and so on. Chinese banks are afraid of sanctions. The more Americans talk about secondary sanctions, the more concerns there are about Russian imports, and they are really declining. That's the first thing. Therefore, the strengthening of the ruble, it has approximately the same nature as in the summer of 2022. Let me remind you that then, after the spring jump in February-March to 120 rubles per dollar, the dollar dropped to 50. And this was due to exactly the same thing. European manufacturers began to leave the Russian market, respectively. There is nothing to simply spend foreign currency on. And there is no way to spend it. Now about the same thing is happening. This is fear. Plus, of course, there is another factor. These are Russian exporters, who must continue to sell foreign exchange earnings, and oil companies, which are stocking up on rubles to pay taxes and dividends at the end of June.
Нефтяные компании, которые
That is, all this is a temporary story. All this was introduced at the same moment, so. Plus, after the American sanctions, some speculators decided to take profits and get away from the foreign exchange market. Yes, well, and see at least from the outside what will happen because of all this. That's why, of course, it's bad for the budget, but most likely, again, the story of 2022 will repeat itself. That is, those tough restrictions that were introduced in August 2023, after the dollar soared above 100, they will be cancelled. Accordingly, here is some indulgence for exporters. For the budget, yes, this is a blow, but, again, the blow is not fatal, because the Russian budget has learned to cope perfectly with the help of the printing press. So, because this is all due to problems with imports, not because import prices are high, but because of technical problems.
Проблемами с импортом не с тем, что цены на импорт высокие, а именно технические проблемы.
This strengthening of the ruble is unlikely to affect inflation. That is, they will not become more and cheaper imported goods, and there will be no more of them in Russia. Therefore, the situation is not very good from all sides, let's put it this way.
But the central bank just stated the failure of imports due to problems with payments. Sanctions and problems with settlements have dealt a tangible blow to imports, the leaders of the central bank stated when discussing the key rate in early June. That's how it happens. The main reason for the difficulty in paying for goods is that 15% of payments made only from the beginning of February to the beginning of June reached the recipients. And how will this affect the key rate and what else? This is the failure of imports due to several problems.
For the key rate, in principle, it does not matter. That is, these things are not connected in any way. The inflation that arises due to problems with imports will in no way be solved by raising the key rate. And it will not reduce inflation, since inflation is accelerated by the same factor that does not depend on the key rate. Let me remind you that this is pumping up the military-industrial sector and high costs, in fact, for waging war. And plus for restoration, the construction of defensive structures, and so on. That is, the production of weapons, the production of everything that is required for war. Fuel, uniforms and everything else. And plus the restoration work. Plus payments to those who are fighting. All this does not depend on the key rate in any way. Regardless of what the key rate is, military enterprises will receive an advance from the Ministry of Defense and spend them on salaries for workers. Therefore, the rate will be 5%, 15% or 25%. It does not matter at all. All this will continue. Inflation will accelerate. The same applies to imports. The high rate will not affect the desire of Chinese banks to service payments for Russian imports as quickly as possible. Accordingly, the increase in the rate hits civilian production, and this only further accelerates inflation. But the central bank has no other choice, because they cannot stop the war. They are responsible for inflation, but they cannot stop the war. They cannot stop the financing of military orders. And the only thing they can do is raise the rate. Well, in fact, they are going to do it.
Given that payment and delivery of goods are still costing and will be even more expensive for importers, and given the risks that we discussed above, may this indicate that the number of importers who will want to have something to do with the Russian Federation will fall?
This is already happening, and the Russian Federation has to pay more and more for the same goods. That is, always, look, again, what we have already talked about. There are certain risks, the risks are growing, which means that the profit that this activity brings should also grow proportionally. The higher the threat of secondary sanctions, the greater the margin for those goods that are supplied to Russia. That's the simple logic. Of course, they will not stop being imported, of course. They will just cost more, regardless of what the rate is, what the exchange rate is, and so on. No one cares.
The profit will not be double, but triple. The more Putin pays there, the less money will be left for the military-industrial complex anyway, right?
No, the money will remain for the military-industrial complex. It's like in that joke, yes, Dad, will you drink less? No, you will eat less, yes. No one will immediately save on the military-industrial complex, yes. They will save on something else. Well, these will be a little worse for sale, something else.
I see.
Here. Therefore, yes. And this situation, it greatly increases Russia's dependence on oil prices. Accordingly, if 2020 showed the stability of the Russian economy before the war, yes, oil prices can fall even to zero, and that's okay. In 2020 this happened. Now the dependence of the Russian economy on oil prices is very, very high.
То сейчас зависимость российской экономики от цен на нефть очень-очень высока.
Yes, there is no reserve. Accordingly, the fall in oil prices will provoke a serious crisis, but again, not in the production of weapons, unfortunately, but in the well-being of citizens.
Can we now somehow predict the fate of the Russian ruble? What will it expect and what factors should affect the changes? Or will it also strengthen in the future?
No, it will most likely not strengthen. It has already been strengthening for one day, that's enough. Most likely, neither the Ministry of Finance, nor exporters, nor anyone else will allow this. Now the dollar exchange rate in Russia depends entirely on the yuan exchange rate, and on how much the dollar is worth in yuan and how much the yuan is worth on the Moscow exchange, respectively. Based on these two rates, the dollar exchange rate in Russia is determined for Russians, for Russian companies and for Russian citizens. The same thing is happening with the euro. As for the yuan exchange rate, here, again, everything depends on oil prices. Everything is very simple on the price of raw materials, and on how much Chinese companies are ready to trade with Russia. That is, now Russia has turned into a raw material predestination of China, and entirely depends, including on the state of the Chinese economy, about how great the demand for raw materials is in China. The Chinese economy will slow down, the demand for raw materials will fall, and, accordingly, Russian goods will be less in demand. Well, problems will begin.
Yes, not bad.
Here it is necessary to analyze not so much the state of the Russian economy as the Chinese one. This is already a primary fact.
And the Chinese economy now, if so, in general, is it still going through difficult times or give or take?
Give or take, and not least thanks to Russia, because the crisis of overproduction that is brewing and which is being talked about both in Europe and in the United States, it was extinguished due to the fact that this sales channel, a sales market, cleared of competitors, appeared.
Его удалось погасить за счет того, что появился вот этот вот канал сбыта, рынок сбыта, очищенный от конкурентов.
Accordingly, the crisis that was predicted there in 2020-2021, China passed it after the post-pandemic. China has bypassed it, and Russia certainly has merits in this. Because the market is huge, it is not the largest in the world, but nevertheless, this is a pleasant appendage that made it possible to avoid more serious problems. But now, unfortunately for China, this market has already been mastered. It's already yesterday. And then it is not very clear how to grow, so the bubble in the real estate market remains. No one really understands what to do with it. And everyone is anxiously waiting for how it will all end. So far, no one can predict how the situation will end, what the situation will result in, firstly, with the regional debt of China, and secondly, with these unsold, built on debt money, but unsold cities that stand in China.
С этими не распроданными, построенными на долговые деньги, но не распроданными городами, которые стоят в Китае.
It is not clear what to do with all this.
Yes, they did, of course. And why were they not taken into account? Were they really not taken into account such factors for the future, that such an overabundance could occur? How does this happen?
This is not a planned economy. They build and build. Companies take loans to build. It seems that the price of a meter is growing. Well done. Especially to some foreign investor from the United States or the United Arab Emirates, they will not go to check how well this real estate is sold or not so well in China. It's being built, it's beautiful. There was money, now square meters. And only then it became obvious that it was not very possible to turn square meters back into money, and the further it went, the less it turned out. But square meters are worth, they are kind of taken into account. Well, yes, someday, maybe someone will buy it. Therefore, yes, there is a problem. The Chinese government and the Central People's Bank of China are trying to solve this problem, including with subsidies and so on. He softens it, tries to make a soft fall out of a hard fall. But the problem has not yet been solved and no one still knows how to solve the problem, with what losses. Of course, we will observe this in development, in dynamics.
EU ambassadors have finally agreed on the 14th package of sanctions against Russia. We have already begun to develop this topic. They are again in such a vector of a powerful and significant package of restrictive measures. At least, this is what Belgium, which currently holds the presidency of the Council of the European Union, informs us. This package, I quote, provides for new targeted measures and maximizes the impact of existing sanctions by closing loopholes. Well, that's it. Apparently, this is invested in the paradigm that now we take not quantitatively, but qualitatively. But still, there are some factors, so to speak, of amortizing the impact of this kind of sanctions on the Russian economy. And what are they?
Well, all the same. Depreciation is still the same. There are so-called friendly countries that help circumvent sanctions. There are European countries that continue, for example, to insist on continuing gas transit through the territory of Ukraine. There are also countries that believe that this gas is more important to them than everything else. Well, the Europeans are trying, maybe not very well. But the main emphasis here, as in the American package, is on ensuring compliance with the measures already taken. Even with regard to Gazprom, these measures are not very strong. That is, as far as I understand, the Europeans have not been able to agree on the rejection of Russian gas, liquid natural gas, for example. Transshipment was banned, but buying was not prohibited. But everything is ahead. Here, this 14th package is precisely aimed at reducing the income of gas pipelines. And plus there are the sanctions that the Americans have already imposed against Novatek projects. Now the Europeans have repeated it. That is, it will complicate Russian gas exports not only from Gazprom, but also from independent producers.
They are trying very well, we are grateful to them for that. And at the end of our conversation, we already mentioned at the beginning that North Korea can provide cheap labor, which the Russian Federation will need and already needs. And a think tank close to the government says the Russian economy faces a shortage of 3.6 million skilled workers by 2035. Given that this is a Russian center close to the authorities, they believe the figure is even higher. Or maybe not. How can you predict and say? And will it be enough from North Korea or elsewhere to compensate for this shortage, and what is it fraught with?
To begin with, the labor shortage, which everyone, including me, is talking about, does not take into account the structure of Russian employment, which is far from optimal. Well, the Russian authorities are also talking about this. They, however, say that we will now bring robots, and we will have robotization that has never been seen anywhere else in the world, and therefore we will no longer need any labor in 5 years. All these mysteries about what will happen in 2035, 2030, they amuse me a lot, because they proceed from the fact that the world will not change a little. Neither Russia, nor peace, nor war will remain in place, and Putin will live more alive than anyone alive. Therefore, it is generally pointless to make plans beyond 2035, and I would not wish beyond 2025. But, nevertheless, yes, most likely, by 2030-31, or maybe in 2032, there will be acute unemployment in Russia, which will be due to the fact that workers in military factories will be out of work, and they will be busy with who knows what.
Рабочие военных заводов окажутся неудел, и занять их будет непонятно чем.
Therefore, everything depends on when Russia stops.
Все зависит от того, когда Россия прекратит.
Well, it was about the 90s in Russia, when the Soviet Union participated in the arms race, and then, when perestroika, disarmament, détente came, the workers of military factories were out of work. Because the country did not need so many weapons, tanks, machine guns and military aircraft. In addition, even if we take all this into account, then demobilization plus the reduction of the army of officials and security forces for a normal country does not need so many agents, spies and counter-spies.
Сокращение армии чиновников и силовиков, для нормальной страны столько агентов, шпионов и контршпионов не нужно.
Including the police, who protect officials from the people, also do not need so much. Therefore, it is possible to talk about a shortage of labor force only taking into account all this. We remember all these factors, we can say that in this economy that Putin has built, there is a shortage of labor. But in a normal economy with a normal structure, in principle, there would be enough labor, and if not, then in an open economy there would indeed be ways to modernize and increase productivity, which are so necessary in Russia.
Экономики с нормальной структурой, в принципе, хватило бы рабочей силы, а если нет, то в открытой экономике действительно были бы способы модернизации и повышения производительности, которые так необходимы России.
And now they are not even for sanctions.
Aha. Everything is connected. Everything is connected and everything works. Maybe not just yesterday, as we would like, but nevertheless, in development, in dynamics and taking into account the passing of time, the effectiveness of everything will prove itself, I believe. Thank you, Maxim, without limits, for this clear, accentuated conversation and for your professional comments, for your position. Of course, first of all, until next time, yes, thank you, sorry for the dog. Yes. No, nothing. We love, and our viewers also love it, because everything is fine. And this is a reaction to the fact that he may have heard the word, Putin. Therefore, let's write it down like this. Thank you, Maxim, until next time.
Yes, all the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim Blант, economist. Ірина Узлова was with him. Friends, thank you very much for watching and listening to us. I hope we can explain to you in an accessible way the processes that are taking place both in the world economies and in the economy of the Russian terrorist and dictator Putin. Write your comments on the topics we have discussed. I am sure that you have something to say and you will form the right opinion for yourself first of all. Come to us again. Please subscribe to YouTube 24. It will help our conversations to advance through its expenses. This is how its algorithms work. Take care of yourself. Believe in the armed forces of Ukraine. See you and win.